This is the fifth in our series of weekly economics briefings, and tonight we'll be talking about coronavirus and the legacy of austerity. My name is Sophie and I work for NEF, and for those of you who don't know, NEF is a think tank working to build a new economy for people and planet. It's great that we have so many of you on the call tonight. I don't know how many we've got, let's have a look. Over 100, wonderful, lovely to have you all with us tonight. We want as many people to be joining in the conversation about building a new economy as possible, building a new economy after the coronavirus and this pandemic. So to help us spread the word, if you could all tweet at the hashtag #NEFbriefing if you are tweeting, maybe think about giving us a little shout out on there if you're enjoying yourself. Next week's briefing is also set to be a really good one. We're going to be looking at organising during the coronavirus, and we'll be hearing from author and journalist Sarah Jaffe, NEF senior organiser Becky Winson, teacher and union rep with the National Education Union Vic Chechi Ribeiro, and mutual aid organiser Minda Burgos Lukes. If you want to register for that now, just to make sure you don't miss out, then sign up on the link which we're posting in the chat right now. Okay, let's get started with this week's call. Very exciting to hear from all the great people we've got on the call tonight. Most of us will have heard the eye-watering numbers and statistics being flouted as the government takes drastic measures to respond to coronavirus. Just this week, we've learned that the government's job retention scheme now supports the wages of 6.3 million employees. And amid these unprecedented interventions, there has obviously been a lot of talk. And we've even started to hear arguments about how we are going to pay for all of this when the recovery phase begins. But is this the right conversation to be having? And are the questions about cost just a distraction? When we hear things like some forecasts predict the debt to GDP ratio may rise to a whopping 129%, what do these numbers really mean? Are they the right starting point for an economic response to the crisis? And are those that are arguing that we need to return to austerity in order to pay for this crisis, like after the financial crisis in 2008, relying on a certain understanding of the economy? The 10 years of austerity we have just seen has left us much less prepared to be able to deal with coronavirus, be that through cuts to public services leading to staff shortages in hospitals, or weakening the welfare system that millions are now relying on after being laid off from work. So this evening we will be asking, what does austerity actually mean, and what effects does it have on the economy and on society? How might we respond to this crisis this time in a way that builds a more resilient economy with socially just outcomes? To answer these questions and more, we're joined by three fantastic speakers. First of all, we will hear from NEF's senior economist, Frank van Lerven. Frank will talk about how the last decade of austerity has affected our ability to be able to deal with this crisis. Then we were supposed to hear from Dr. Jonna Montgomery, but unfortunately she's had to pull out as she's not very well. So instead we're hoping to be joined by Karis Roberts, who is the Executive Director of IPPR and who has very kindly offered to stand in at such short notice. Thanks ever so much, Karis. We'll also hear from macro hedge fund manager, economist and writer Ellen Lonergan. I'm sorry, Eric, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right. I'll check that with you when we get to you. Lonergan, I can't say it, I'm sorry, Eric. Eric will give an analysis of where the government went wrong in its response to the last crisis and the role of central banks and the Bank of England in responding this time around. As ever, as the speakers are talking, please post any questions you have for them in the chat box and we will do our best to ask them. We're aiming to finish just before 8 p.m. this evening so that we can clap for our carers. So apologies if we don't have time to ask yours. Okay, great. Let's start with our first speaker, the senior economist at NEF, Frank van Lerven. Frank, are you out there?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Frank, you think the government has been worrying about risks to the economy by focusing too much on its own balance sheets. Can you explain why you think this has left us less able to deal with the crisis and basically what you think their better plan might be for them?
Yeah, of course, and thanks so much. So first of all, I should say, kind of preempt my talk by suggesting that this is a broader piece that is based on ideas from many people across the board. But we are going to be releasing a more technical report that elaborates and goes into further detail around the things that I'm talking about. And so please keep an eye out, watch that space. So basically, we start with the premise that Advocates of austerity claim that responsible governments should essentially tighten their belts and they should reduce the public debt during normal times to essentially create physical space, and by that I mean room for further borrowing during the bad times. So there's that famous quote by the ex-chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, who said, "We must act to fix the roof when the sun is shining." And we're seeing recent statements by the government echo this perspective, and essentially, in effect, what it means is that austerity, which is essentially by cutting expenditures today, we can make our economy more resilient to crises tomorrow. And essentially what follows from this way of thinking and this logic is that the principal measure or barometer for preparedness to a shock has become essentially the level of debt. So rather than thinking about risks to the economy, the government has been very focused on the risks to its own public balance sheet. And by fixating on reducing the size and risks to government borrowing, the government has neglected the accumulation of numerous risks and vulnerabilities that have essentially built up elsewhere in the economy and society. So far from increasing the resilience to the economy, the buildup of these risks and vulnerabilities has weakened our capacity to cope and respond to the consequences of the corona pandemic. And there's been basically a disproportionate focus on the fiscal risks of the government's balance sheet that neglects the crucial function of public expenditures and the government's balance sheet, which is to absorb and pool risk throughout society and the wider economy. Indeed, the public sector's balance sheet in part exists to assume, not to avoid risks that would otherwise fall into families and firms. So the first place that we try and elaborate on this is, and this is the most clear one, is in the health, social care and welfare systems, leaving households and public services much more exposed and less prepared for the impacts of the pandemic. Cuts in public spending mean we have much lower amount of spending going to NHS than normal. Historically, spending on the NHS would increase by about 4% a year to keep up with growing demand, but over the last decade, it's only been growing at about 1.25%. Had the NHS actually increased at the same rate as it did just under Margaret Thatcher, we would have had an extra 15 billion to spend on the NHS each year. And now this has left us with a literal workforce crisis in the NHS. And this has contributed to a significant deterioration in the quality of care, from waiting times to decreasing numbers of beds and the like. At the same time, there's been a massive reduction in spending on social care. We've seen a 38% drop in central government funding across the whole of the UK in social care. Care workers only make up to about £16,000 a year, with the mean hourly wage being lower than the real living wage. And this has contributed to staff turnover being super high. About 40% of care workers leave their jobs each year, and about a third of those end up leaving the sector completely. And we now have about 110,000 roles in the social care sector being unfulfilled. That's 1 in 10. So at the same time, though, austerity has considerably weakened our welfare system. And while the Chancellor has made some really useful temporary measures with the job retention scheme and self-employed schemes, we've shown at NEF that about 5.7 million people are probably going to fall between the cracks of these schemes. And essentially, they're going to fall onto the weakest safety net in advanced economies and in the UK's post-war history. So while universal credit has been raised by about £20 per week, amounting to about a 7 billion increase overall, it only reverses about 20% of total welfare cuts we've seen since 2010. And to put this into more, a better perspective, the meagerness of universal credit is illustrated by the fact that a former full-time worker on a minimum wage that has to fall onto universal credit would make roughly only a third of their former income, a loss of about £210 a week. Now, the next part, the next place where we've seen a buildup of risk is in household income and finances. And I was hoping that Jonah was going to talk a bit more about this, but I'll give my best shot. Now, there's the reason a reduction in government spending can negatively affect the private sector and leave it more constrained is because government spending essentially is the income of the private sector. This can be the income of the private sector. When the government spends, it results in the income increasing of the private sector. And so when there's been a huge reduction in spending by the government, then this suppresses the incomes of the private sector. And NEF has shown that these cuts have suppressed incomes across the economy, and this has resulted in about a £3,600 cut per household in 2018-2019 alone. And what we show in our paper basically is that by suppressing incomes of households, then households have been encouraged essentially to take on more debt. And because the cuts in public spending have disproportionately fell onto lower income households, and there's also been a disproportionate reduction in their wages over time, they've basically been hit the most. And so we've seen there's about between 8 and 10 million people are now over indebted. That means they're spending about a quarter of their income simply on consumer credit payments, not mortgage payments. This over indebtedness is, and again, it's particularly concentrated in people with low incomes, with less than £30,000 a year. And just under half, 44% of all households spend more than a quarter of their income on debt when they have an income of about £15,000 a year. So basically what we're trying to say here is that austerity has reduced the income of the private sector, and especially on households, and disproportionately on poorer households, which has forced them to take on more debt. And in doing so, we're going into this pandemic with households being really leveraged and with less of a fallback position, if you will, going into this crisis. Now, the third point, and this is the final one, is that the irony of austerity is that it's proved largely self-defeating, and that in delivering higher measures of public debt instead of reducing them. So the cuts in expenditure and the negative implications this has for economic activity leads to a reduction in government tax revenues. And what I mean by that is that government income is not independent of its spending, not like a household. So what an individual household, let's say my wife and I, if we reduce our spending, then that'll have a trivial effect on the macro economy. But the government spending makes up about 25% of all spending in the economy. So when it reduces its spending, it has a huge impact on the wider economy, but it also reduces its own tax intake. And then the second thing that's really important to note here is that we're seeing central banks left, right, and center printing huge amounts of money. And I don't think it's a secret anymore that they're printing this money to help finance or fund governments. And so this throws into a whole question around the idea that we need to save during good times so that we can react and have room for borrowing during bad times. If the central bank can print money and so forth, then this throws a big question into that whole idea. And this is something we get into more in our paper. And I'll leave it at that. So.
Thanks so much, Frank. That was a really great starting point for the discussion. If you want to find out more about the things Frank was just talking about, then have a listen to the last episode of our weekly economics podcast, which we recorded with Frank on austerity and coronavirus just last week. We'll post the link to that in the chat right now. Firstly, Frank, you did touch on it a little bit there, but in terms of like the best case scenario, like the gold standard better plan for recovery, could you give us some very brief thoughts on that, and then I'll ask you some of the questions that have been posted in the chat.
Sure. So the first thing is binarily focusing. The problem is binarily focusing on the risks, the fiscal risks on its own balance sheet, the government debt. austerity has led to the buildup of risks elsewhere. So a main recommendation that we think is that when making decisions regarding its borrowing, the government should consider the long-term impact of these decisions on society and the economy as a whole, both in a strict economic sense and more broadly in terms of the positive benefits that stem from investments in public goods. And in this respect, I think the government needs to think about essentially three things. Cuts to public spending are not the only way to create fiscal space. There is taxing that can dampen aggregate demand, free up real resources in the economy. There is regulation, there is credit policy, and then there's the central bank. Two, borrowing is only one side to the government's balance sheet, the liability side. There is also the asset side, which almost always gets lost in this conversation, and we always kind of get lost in these discussions about, oh, we don't want to saddle future generations with huge levels of debt. But I would suggest that this could be fundamentally wrong, because the government can borrow to invest in certain projects, and these projects will pay for themselves. Now, thirdly, is the government the government should always ask itself, is the government acting irresponsibly by not investing in the people and the goods and services that make up the UK economy? And basically, is it acting irresponsibly by not taking full advantage of its fiscal potential? So based on these three principles, I think there are three things to focus on in the recovery. There's more, but I'll just mention three if that's okay. One, we need strong and stable, well-paid jobs. The truth is we didn't recover from the last global financial crisis. Living standards are lower than they were before 2008. And I think that this really has to change. And we don't need to just think about the quantity of jobs, we need to think about the quality. Two, the recovery should be focused on climate change and environmental goals, or there should be a big part of it focused on that. And the government needs to focus on green infrastructure to help us meet our climate and environmental goals, but also investing in social care and the NHS. These are green jobs, by the way, or sustainable jobs, and they're often forgot about. And I think we really need to build resilience up in these sectors as well. Finally, we need to rebalance our economy. We have a severely unbalanced economy that's skewed towards finance and towards property. The government wants to talk about weaning. We need to wean ourselves off of a financialized growth model, and we need to move towards one that is centered upon real resources and enabling people everywhere across the economy to lead a fulfilling and rewarding livelihood.
Great, thanks, Frank. That is a very good, detailed three-point plan. So hopefully someone from the government has dialed into this Zoom meeting. Now, just a question from the chat from Luke Whiting. If you could give us a fairly brief answer on this, Frank, so we can fit everyone else in. Whatever the economic reality, global financial markets clearly believe or claim to believe public sector debt is an important thing to control. Would the UK be strong enough to face down these markets?
Yes, well, I don't think it's something to completely ignore, and I think Eric will probably be able to answer this better than I do. But I think basically in this respect, we have to remember that the government actually issues is not necessarily financially constrained. We have a central bank, we borrow in our own currency, we have a floating exchange rate. So we can't ever really go broke. I would suggest that actually the central bank has quite a large scope to control its own interest rates, and we can therefore, I would suggest that yes, doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about financial markets, but I think that there's way too much of a disproportionate focus on that element of the equation.
Great, thanks so much, Frank, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, thanks for having me.
You are most welcome. Let us move on to our next speaker, macro hedge fund manager, economist, and writer, Eric Lonergan. Eric, please tell me how to say your name, and are you here?
I am here. Hopefully you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Yeah, and my surname's Lonergan, but you can pronounce it whatever way you want.
I think I got it one of those times. I don't know which one.
Phonetically is fine.
So, thanks for joining us tonight.
No, thank you very much for having me.
what is your analysis of where the government went wrong in dealing with the last crisis, and what could be the role of central banks and the Bank of England this time around?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that, and I think policy economists and macroeconomists, academics, all of us are in many ways all culpable in this. But I think that the thing I would criticize the economics community, including the government, for not doing since the last financial crisis was preparing for a recession. So I don't think anybody can be criticized as such for not preparing for a pandemic. It certainly, there wasn't a groundswell of opinion saying, let's prepare for a pandemic. That was unpredictable, but it wasn't unpredictable that at some point in time there would be a recession. And what's been made glaringly obvious is that we are deeply ill-prepared, and we really shouldn't be, on what to do when recession strikes. And although this recession has some unique features to it, largely the cause is quite unique because to some extent it's self-imposed. The economics of it, I don't think are particularly unique. They have a lot in common with recessions that have occurred before. Now, I do think a lot of what the government has done has been very helpful and suitably ambitious, and the government should be praised for that. I think there is a lot more that could be done with fiscal policy, but that's not what I'm going to focus on. I just really want to focus on monetary policy and argue that there's an awful lot more that the Bank of England can do. And I think much of it is a failure of the mind. So I think there's some very powerful things the Bank of England could do quite quickly, which would have an immediately beneficial impact on the economy. And largely I see the role of economic policy at this point in time as preserving the economy. So in a sense, the economy is deliberately on hold. We're saying to households, don't go out, don't go to your office, don't go out and spend money, stay at home. This has implications for firms. This has implications for factories, for all of these businesses and individuals. So what the fiscal and monetary authorities want to be trying to do is keep the oil greasing the wheels, which means keeps the cash flows within households stable, keeping the cash flows within businesses so we don't have business failure, we don't have very high unemployment. That's what we should be trying to preserve household income so that when we're able to go back to work, we're all in a position to do that. In other words, we haven't done permanent damage to the economy. That is the objective of policy. So what should the central bank, the Bank of England, be doing? I think conventional wisdom is that interest rates are too low for monetary policy to do anything. And almost we've just come to accept by assumption that the role of the Bank of England is to stabilize financial markets and, as Frank alluded to, perhaps to provide support for fiscal policy. Now, I think this perspective is entirely incorrect, and there is an awful lot more that the Bank of England can do. And we've seemed to have forgotten that its job is actually stabilizing the economy and not financial markets. So financial markets are a means to an end, but it can actually directly help us to stabilize the economy. So what should the Bank of England do when interest rates are zero? It's clear that further interest rate cuts at this point are as likely to do damage as they are to provide benefits because they affect savers, they affect the banking system's ability to function. So there are lots of problems with just bringing down interest rates. So I want to focus really on two things that I think the Bank of England could do. One is what I have called dual interest rates, which is very simply a policy whereby the Bank of England no longer relies on a single interest rate, which is what most of us would be used to as changes in base rate, but instead has two interest rates. It has an interest rate on lending, which it tries to target, and an interest rate on deposits, which it tries to target. So that's the first policy that I want to talk about briefly, which might take people some time to get their heads around because it's new. But other central banks have started to do this. We have the tools to do it. And it provides a huge stimulus. The second thing I think that the Bank of England should be doing with the approval of the government is it should, via the banking system, be transferring cash to all households. So literally sending checks to households electronically. So we should be able to come in, our bank account should effectively be credited with funds, on Monday. And the Bank of England can continue to do this as is required. And I think we need to set up the framework to do that, and it's not that difficult to do. So the first policy, which is dual interest rates, how does that work? So this is very simple. When you get close to zero, you need two interest rates. You need to separately continue to cut the interest rate on loans. So all borrowers benefit from lower interest rates. And you actually need to either raise or leave unchanged the interest rate on savings. Ideally, you would actually raise the interest rate on savings. So if you raise the interest rate on savings and you cut the interest rate on loans, everybody wins, right? So both depositors and borrowers are beneficiary. The problem with standard interest rate policies, when you cut interest rates, borrowers benefit and savers lose income. At the moment, the economy, both savers and borrowers need financial support. They need cash flows to be enhanced. Now, how do we do this in practice? Effectively, the Bank of England, I'm not going to talk too much about this. We can discuss it in Q&A if people are interested, but the Bank of England actually has the means, and all central banks in the developed world have the means to do this now, because they have lending schemes. The Bank of England's is called the Term Funding Scheme, whereby it lends to the banks at very low interest rates, conditional on certain behavior from the banks. And then it pays an interest rate on bank deposits at the central bank, which determines the interest rate that savers receive. So what I'm suggesting essentially is that we cut interest rates on mortgages, and I would try to get mortgage interest rates down to about -1%. So if mortgage interest rates were at -1%, anyone with an outstanding mortgage today would stop paying interest and they'd receive a payment from their bank. And I think SME loans should be down at zero. So my problem with the policies that we've seen so far is, in a sense, they've gone in the wrong order. They've tried to use the banking system by starting with funding rates, whereas we need to go to the goal, which is that we need to get interest rates on loans down. So we need to get mortgage rates down to at least -1%, and we need to get SME loans down to zero. And the Bank of England could do this in a very simple way, which is it says to the major commercial banks, it says, okay, the Bank of England is going to lend money to you at -3 to 4% for 18 months. That will only be available to you if you bring down the interest rate on mortgages to -1%, okay? And you bring SME loans down to zero. Now that requires no form filling. No one needs to call up a commercial bank. Nobody needs to go online. That would just happen automatically, right? So one of the tests of policies in a crisis is how quickly can you do it and how efficiently. One of the biggest problems we have with all of the government policies we have at the moment is they're essentially too bureaucratic. They require too much administration. They require people to go online. You need to make bank loan applications. This just clogs up the whole system. Whereas actually a system of dual interest rates would work with immediacy. Now, what else can we do? And this relates to the idea of crediting all households, all adult citizens in the UK with a cash transfer from the Bank of England. This could be done via a perpetual zero interest rate loan. So you want to ignore the jargon, but effectively I'm providing a loan that never gets repaid at zero interest rate, which is effectively a transfer. And the way to do this, again, it's about implementation, is that the Bank of England would instruct the 4 or 5 largest banks in the UK by coverage. So look, you want to effectively, 98% of the UK population roughly has a bank account, right? So there's absolutely no reason why we can't use the banking system to credit them with money. So what we would do is commission the 4 or 5 largest banks in the UK, and then say it's up to them to do the due diligence on organization. So they have to make sure that somebody who has 3 different bank accounts doesn't get 3 payments. They have to set up a database and organize it themselves. And they effectively have to accredit each adult citizen in the UK with X amount, whatever the Bank of England deems necessary to stabilize the economy. For people who don't bank with those banks, they can go online to the bank, whoever they do bank with, and make a loan application that way. And if you don't have a bank account at all, which is about 2% of the population, either you can open a bank account, which is about 30% of that 2% voluntarily don't have it. For the relatively small fraction of the population who don't have and haven't had access to bank accounts, they would be eligible to apply online for a prepay card of some variety. Now, people will say, this is still not 100% coverage. 98% coverage of the adult citizens in the UK would be better coverage than virtually any policy that I'm aware of. We have huge difficulties in getting policies to reach people who need them. Now, I think the other strength of a perpetual loan scheme, or effectively a cash transfer to households, versus other forms of policy support, is you can fine tune it literally at the press of a button. So once you have that system in place, the Bank of England can just say, okay, next week I want every adult citizen to get £1,000. If in 2 weeks' time we think that we need to extend lockdown, I can do another £1,000. It's like cutting interest rates. It's very, very quick, and it's very, very effective. Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap up there. There is an awful lot more the Bank of England can do. By using dual interest rates, so targeting loans, interest rates on loans and interest rates on deposits independently, they can give both savers and borrowers an immediate stimulus, right? So an immediate boost to cash flow. I think by using a perpetual loan structure distributed by the banking system, cash can be provided to all households in the UK. To cut a long story short, currently we are threatening huge self-harm through extremely high unemployment and widespread business failure. There is enormous financial stress across the entire household sector. We do have the means to tackle this with minimal bureaucracy. It's not perfect, but it would absolutely be, keep the lifeblood of the economy flowing. And I think these policies need to be implemented very, very urgently. Perhaps as a final remark, what I would say, the absolute objective of policy currently should be to err on the side of doing too much, because we will almost certainly do too little. Right? That is crystal clear to me as an economist in the current environment. The biggest risk is we don't give enough stimulus. Now, if we're lucky enough to come out the other side, right? So when everybody says, what about the stock of public sector debt? What about all this money you're printing? That is actually very, very easy to deal with, which is if we need to, and the economy is booming, which effectively means you've given it too much stimulus. If it's booming in 18 months' time or 2 years' time, we can raise taxes and we can raise interest rates. It's very easy to reverse these policies. It's very, very difficult to stabilize the economy effectively right now.
Thanks so much, Eric. That was fantastic. If you wanted to find out more about the things Eric was talking about just now, then check out his book, Angrynomics from Brown University. We'll share the link in the chat now. We've also included some other links to further reading on the ideas that Eric was discussing there. Okay, Eric, I'm going to try something different for one of these briefings and do like a quick fire round of questions, because there's been a lot of questions for you in the chat. So thanks to Martin, George, David, Sophie, Adam, Richard, Diana, Lauren. There's been so many different questions. I'm just going to give you a few. If you just keep your answers pretty short, then we'll try and get through a few of them. Eric, what is the rationale for boosting disposable income and consumer demand in the midst of a supply side shutdown?
Because most households in the UK, or a great many of them, probably the overwhelming majority, are facing huge financial risk and the stress associated with that. Many people are worried about business survival, about losing their jobs, or they have lost their jobs. If they're furloughed, they don't know if they'll ever get their jobs back. We're seeing an extraordinarily high rate of business failure. So the problem is multifold, but the critical thing is to keep firms' cash flow flowing and household cash flow flowing, so a temporary problem doesn't cause permanent economic and human damage.
Okay, great.
It's as simple as that.
Question from George. Why should only large commercial banks earn extra interest on helicopter money?
Well, or you're not actually, it's absolutely critical here that the funding is only available to the banks contingent on them passing it on to borrowers. This is very important. This is what's different about the policy as I'm designing it than one that just gives them preferential funding. I would only give preferential funding to banks contingent on them passing it on. I think the reason for using 4 or 5 banks rather than all of the banking, so you would keep their margins on mortgages the same, right? So really the way I've tried to calibrate it is by starting by saying I want a negative interest rate on mortgages to stop defaults from happening and to provide financial relief to those with mortgages. And if that goes to a negative interest rate, and then you can back out what you need to do to stop it causing the banks from being insolvent, right? Because there's no point in us bankrupting our banks. But you don't want to give preferential treatment to any bank. You want to keep it to 4 or 5 banks so that it's manageable, because this needs to be done really quickly.
Okay, great. Anne Pettifor believes we should bring back capital cross-border controls. What's your view? It's from David.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to what Frank said. I mean, Frank was asked about the government bond market. You know, the issue of fiscal policy is really quite easy. If you're worried, if anybody worried about the Bank of England, not the Bank of England, the Treasury funding itself, just needs to look at where gilt yields are. Gilt yields are 0.2, right? 0.2%. What are gilt yields is what the government uses to fund its activities. The UK government can borrow at the lowest interest rates it has ever been able to borrow at. After inflation, it's being paid by financial markets to borrow. This is a complete myth that the government has a financial constraint currently. There's a really simple fiscal rule, which is look at the interest rate on the cost of borrowing of the government set by the market. Right? If that starts rising very high, you have to tighten fiscal policy. If that has collapsed to the lowest levels in history, there is excess demand for gilts. So there really is not a financing constraint. Not to mention, just as an aside, the Bank of England has bought somewhere close to 30% of the outstanding stock of government debt. The Bank of England's part of the government. So we have effectively cancelled 30% of our debt as a matter of accounting. So the whole stuff about the government debt is a huge error of analysis. There was no increase in government debt after the financial crisis because most of it was bought by the Bank of England. And the Bank of England is part of the state's balance sheet, right? We own the Bank of England collectively.
I've got a Bank of England question, so I'm going to ask you that one last. Why is the Bank of England only there to save the economy? The economy is just a medium for life and well-being, is it not?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I'm wondering exactly what they're trying to get. The key thing about the Bank of England, why does the Bank of England exist in a sense, is because as a society, we realize that this power to print money is an extraordinary power. Right? I mean, David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, kind of identified 3 fundamental bases to sort of a well-functioning society, which is language, law, and money, and viewed them as spontaneous institutions. And I guess if you destroy either your legal system or your monetary system, it is a disaster for a society. And collectively as societies, we said, well, we want the institution that controls the printing press to be very, very prudently managed, which is why we made the Bank of England operationally independent. So in some sense, the central bank has always been slightly sacrosanct, because otherwise, if you get somebody very irresponsible with the power to print money, they can destroy our society. Now that's slightly dramatic terminology, but there's some truth in that, which is why we have a Bank of England. Now that is not to say it should absolutely be subject to scrutiny. So when I'm suggesting that the bank should distribute cash to all households, I do believe that it should seek parliamentary support in order to do that. It is true that any change that the Bank of England makes has distributional consequences, but the distributional consequences of transferring money to households is more transparent, is more obvious than most central bank operations, in which case I think it does require political legitimacy, that the bank can't just elect to do something of that magnitude of its own accord.
Great, thank you so much, Eric, and thanks so much for joining us this evening. It's been great hearing from you. Frank was very excited about everything you were saying. He was doing clapping emojis all over the shop. Before I move on to our third speaker, I just want to do a quick shout out to all the NEF supporters on our call. Your generosity is helping to fund our responses to the crisis so far, including supporting us to run these briefings. So thank you very much for everything you're doing to support us. If you are not a NEF supporter and you'd like to become one, then please check out the new supporters network page on our website. We're posting a link to this in the chat now. Okay, amazing. So let's move on to our third speaker. Executive Director of IPPR, Karis Roberts, are you there? I hope you're there.
I am, yes. I was just waiting to be unmuted.
Yeah.
Hi, Soph.
Hello, how are you?
Well, thank you. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for stepping in at the last minute. We are very happy to have you. We are in uncharted political waters at the moment. Boris Johnson said just this week that austerity is over, and he'd never liked the word anyway. Do you believe this? How should we understand the meaning of austerity in the current political context, and where do you see austerity, or do you see austerity rearing its head at the moment, or just down the track a little bit there?
Yeah, so I think it was quite interesting, the wording of what Boris Johnson actually said. So he said that he doesn't like the term, which any self-interested politician is likely to agree with, given that austerity is wildly unpopular at the moment. So he said that austerity wouldn't be part of his policy agenda, but and I think, to be fair to Johnson, I don't think it's in his DNA to want to be the fiscally prudent type of politician. But that being said, I do think that this is a live debate and one we need to be talking about, partly because there are some very powerful actors on the right of politics who have been calling for further calls for austerity, and indeed most of Johnson's party would have agreed with the past 10 years of austerity and are likely to want more of it. But also because there are many meanings of austerity. So what exactly do we mean by it? Do we mean that a nominal amount of money has been cut? Do we mean that certain benefits haven't been raised in line with inflation? Do we mean that the overall budget is going down, or do we mean that certain parts of it are going down? And what I think you could see that is, after a big stimulus package, which we will see, maybe not as big as it needs to be, but after that, I think later down the line, we might indeed see some form of austerity creeping in. And so I do think we need to be having these conversations. As Eric said, this isn't about what happens immediately. I don't think we're going to see huge cutbacks in spending right now. We can absolutely afford to spend the money that's needed to rescue the economy. In fact, we cannot afford not to. This is about what happens afterwards, in my view. And I think one of the key things that opponents of austerity will need to be ready with is not just the arguments against austerity, but also some alternatives. So I think it's really interesting that in the public debate we've got lots of attention on monetary financing, whether that can play a part. I think the two parts that I'd want to draw attention to, one is tax reform, and I'm going to park that and come back to it. But essentially, after this crisis is over, we knew that we were headed for not having public services on a sustainable footing anyway. What do we need to do to have a steady state of tax raising that can fund public services, that doesn't leave us in this mess again, and unprepared for the next crisis in public services? But then secondly, I think we also need to talk about how we grow the tax base, because effectively the most useful thing we can do to make sure that our deficit and debt don't balloon is to make sure that our economy, or at least the tax base, is growing back to where it was before. So that is about creating jobs, and we know that investment can do that. With all of these things, I think the other side of this that we haven't discussed that much today is it's not just how much we're spending, it's not just how much money we're pumping into the economy, it's about where that money goes, both in terms of determining the strength of the recovery that happens, but also who wins and who pays at the end of the day. So in terms of where it needs to go, I think we need to be really clear that there are certain parts of our welfare state that have been absolutely hacked and slashed back over the last 10 years, and that need to be rebuilt up if we're to avoid the catastrophic impacts on society that we might see in this crisis, if that could happen again in future crises, including the climate crisis. So that would mean reinvesting in our benefit system, making sure that those on low to middle incomes have additional income, but also that any of us who might find ourselves out of work without an income have that safety net. That also acts as an automatic stabilizer in terms of making sure that crises don't hit demand too strongly. Secondly, I think we need to be investing in jobs-rich parts of the economy. As Frank said, I think that needs to be a green recovery. So investing in green jobs around the country, as well as social infrastructure that enables our country and our economy to run. And then thirdly, I think coming back to that question of who benefits, and this is where the spending and the tax come together. So we've got some work out on this next week, which people should look out for, essentially assessing who has benefited from the package of support that the government's announced so far. And what we have seen is that, surprise, surprise to no one who's been following this stuff, while a lot of families have been expected to take an income hit, even those who have received the furlough scheme, for instance, the same old figures in the economy actually haven't been asked to take the same hit. So, for instance, landlords have been protected, including commercial landlords, but also private landlords. Banks have been relatively protected in terms of the state backing up loans that they're giving out, but still being able to charge interest rates after the initial year is up. Those sorts of things are shaping who is going to be okay coming out of this and who is going to be left in serious trouble. So I do think there's a serious piece here in terms of where the spending goes, where any future tax rises go, but then also how that monetary financing that might be going on plays out to determine the distributional picture. And that's one thing that actually, if I had a question for Eric, it would be, how can we make sure that the any helicopter money going into households, but also the dual interest rates, don't just reflate an economy where the same old people are winning and the same old people losing. So for instance, if we put money, if we make mortgages cheaper, is that going to benefit people with deposits who can effectively buy up the housing market and do very well out of that? So that's a few reflections from me. I think this is absolutely a live debate that we still need to be having, whether our politicians like the term or not, but would also ask that we think about where the spending is going, not just whether it can happen.
Thanks very much, Karis. That was, as ever, very brilliant. And thanks very much for standing in at the last minute. Karis was one of several economists who contributed to a great piece on alternatives to austerity in the New Statesman recently. We'll post a link to that in the chat. And you can also follow Karis on Twitter at Karis Roberts, which we'll also post into the chat. We've had a few questions, Karis, so I'm gonna ask you a couple. One of them actually touches on what you were talking about at the end there, which is like, how can we prevent the financially high and mighty simply yet again turning coronavirus into another exercise in disaster capitalism, out of which the economic and social divide between the very rich and everyone else becomes even more pronounced and generally socially dangerous? I think I can guess your answer to this, but I would love to hear it.
I'm intrigued to know what you would guess. So I think there are a set of short-term options that you could take, including adjusting the expenditure that households have. So whether that's a rent freeze, utility freeze. I know that NEF have done good work on this, I think last week or this week. But I think we also need to be looking slightly longer term. So as we come out of the crisis, on the basis that a lot of these measures have had to be put in place very quickly, and also that a Conservative government might not have been thinking as much as we would like about the distributional impacts of its spending, I think we need to be having that argument about who pays and how we claw back some of that benefit that might have been gained. So I would argue that medium to long-term conversation needs to include wealth taxes. Obviously that needs to be done carefully so not to take demand out of the economy, but actually if there's anywhere we could, unproductive economic activity could be taxed, and that could actually benefit the economic recovery. But then I think the final element of this question is really, the reason these measures are protecting incomes for landlords and banks is that we're pumping money into an unequal economic model. So in the longer term, we need to look at how we restructure that and to make sure that ordinary people can benefit from it too. So that includes policies around ownership, for instance, whether that's a sovereign wealth fund, which is something Eric Lonergan has written for us about, but also whether there are kind of wider economy-wide measures we need to be looking at, including executive pay, dividend payouts, and those sorts of elements. But look out for our paper next week, because it has a whole suite of policy options there.
I will have my eyes peeled for that. And wealth taxes was my guess, so I win a prize. Another question in the chat from Mike. I think it's from the chat. It may be from an email we had sent in earlier. People do that. So in future briefings, if people want to email questions in advance, please do. Which is, what will encourage governments across the world to develop a more ecologically sustainable and caring economy that is no longer based on mass production and consumption?
That's quite a big question. Don't know if I can answer it fully. I mean, I think the key thing with all of these is that as much as, you know, as a think tanker, I would like to think that us making the intellectual argument and the evidence, putting forward the evidence, will make an impact. That has to be married with popular demand and political movement building. So that's the kind of the short answer. In terms of what those individual steps towards that look like, I do think it's going to be interesting to see what devolved and local governments can do through this crisis and what they're looking at in terms of how they can step in to support their local economies, but also rebuild something better. And we do have progressive governments and progressive policymakers across the UK who are thinking about lots of these issues. And I think there's some quite exciting work going on, for instance, in Welsh Government, Scottish Government, and some of the local authorities. So perhaps my optimistic, if I had an optimistic view, it would be that some of those governments will actually be able to demonstrate quite a different way of doing things and building back.
An optimistic view sounds like the best place to finish. So thanks very much, Carys. That was excellent. And once again, thanks for joining us. That is Oh no, I was muted. I did the Zoom thing. I'll start again. I don't know when I was muted, so I'll just carry on. But that's nearly all we have time for this evening. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and thanks to all the speakers. Just a reminder that you can sign up to next week's briefing on organising during coronavirus, and the link for that is in the chat. Please do check out our website, neweconomics.org, to catch up on all our ongoing work. We've been publishing analysis and policy related to the pandemic, such as the rent freeze work that Carys just mentioned. And we've got much more coming up in the next few weeks. So if you keep your eyes peeled on our website, there is even a special coronavirus section where you can see all the work we've been doing. So keep your eyes on that in the next few weeks. Thank you very much once again for everyone coming and joining us. We've got 6 minutes to clap for Carys, so you can start your bank holiday weekend right now. Stay safe, and we'll see you next week.